Hey everybody. So, I love speaking at these events because it's always a new challenge for me. I always have to come up with something interesting that I'll combine with languages. And today I'm going to do a little thing about data science. So for anyone who wouldn't have seen my talk like 2 years ago or whatever in New York, I've had a very varied career over the years. I've been youth hostel receptionist. I've worked on the FTSE 100, the stock market in the UK, been a writer, blogger, YouTuber, a million things. But my background is originally engineering. So, studied engineering, and I love mathematics. I was a mathematics teacher, and statistics and data, these are things that I get excited about, you know? So I gave myself the challenge to see how I can combine that with languages, and I've got some interesting things that I wanted to show you guys today. So if you imagine data, maybe you've got this other visualization that you imagine it's more like a bored guy sitting at a computer looking at all this kind of stuff here. And a lot of data is that. A lot of data is just pure lists of things, or if people fill out a survey that you have to process that information, that it's just their answers. And that can be very boring. And I want to show you a different side of that, a side that really gets me excited, and how we can apply that to languages, of course. And what got me interested in this is when my blog started to grow. In the very, very first year, I wanted to see, now that I have, at the time, a couple of thousand people who were reading the blog, and I was thinking, okay, I can maybe help them by showing them things about themselves they may not know. And this is my first little experiment into proper practical data science. And that was this. I asked this question. Which of the following courses or materials have you used and found to be beneficial? And we got all these answers. Now, there are lots of scientific problems with doing a thing like this, that you can't really rely on these results. Can anyone think of a few? Like just the amount of people, yeah. So the sample size is tiny. This is, if you add those numbers, they could multiple choice click multiple ones, but let's say there's maybe 200 or 300 people. So that's a problem. What else? And I can give you a few other problems. This is kind of self-selected. So I put this on my site saying, hey, here's a survey, come click it. And the problem is, the people who tend to click the surveys are already skewing the data, because those are people who are more likely to act a particular way, or they're more enthusiastic, you know? And it's also how I phrase the question. And people might, perhaps, they say found to be beneficial. Well, that's their own analysis. They don't really know. Like if they tried multiple things, they tried 10 courses, and they found the last one was what made them actually speak the language. Does that really tell us that last one is the beneficial one? Because maybe all the ones before it kind of compounded on one another. So that's the problem. You can't really look at this and like conclusively say, oh, this is wrong, and clearly this is the best course. And that's not quite what I was actually trying to do. I knew this ahead of time. I knew that I was going to get information like this that's not really going to give me something I can draw useful conclusions from. What they didn't know is I had a secret second survey that they were taking. Because at the very start, I got them to answer this question. What's your experience in language learning? And you could see how they separated. We had two different kinds of successful learners. Some that had been doing it independently, and some that had used traditional academic methods. And we had people who had not yet successfully learned another language, and then we had other. So this let me do something. This let me split the people answering the questions into two different groups. And when you do that, then you can start to see some interesting things come out. Because then I could separate the successful from the not yet successful learners. And I could ask reverse questions. Instead of saying, what do you find beneficial? I can ask, what have you used and found to be unhelpful? Because that's pushing the data in a slightly different direction. And when you compare these two things, you start to see this. And this is what I wanted to show the people who are filling out this survey. That essentially, those who were successful versus those who were unsuccessful, they had this very big difference in the two results. We had 262 courses for the non-successful learners, but only 106 non-successful learners in total. And when you put those two together, you actually see that we had like 1.9 courses per successful learner and 2.5 courses per non-successful learner. And this tells me not a generalization that I can make about everybody in the world, but at least I could tell the people who took this survey that the unsuccessful people, maybe their problem was they were just doing too many courses. They would like start a course and they were being such perfectionists that they would be like, this course isn't solving all my problems, I'll start a new course. And they would try that course and it wouldn't really solve their problems either, so they'd start a new course. Whereas the successful learners would accept no course is perfect, so maybe if I try an average of 2 courses. And it's not super conclusive, it's not very scientific because there's all sorts of other problems that you need to have confidence in. But this was my first little experiment into data science, something that I could learn from and see how I can apply elsewhere. And for me, data science is kind of taking all of the information you possibly can about a group of people, about a project that you're learning, and seeing what information is hidden in that. So that's why if I just asked people, do you think more courses helps you learn a language better, then that's framing a question that's going to force them into a little box. Whereas if I can ask the right questions, if I can give them a different survey that they are not really aware of, they might see some interesting information. So that's for a small group, but there are things you can do when you get to a larger group. And there's also better ways of presenting the information. So you just saw a bunch of bar charts, and that's fine. But when you get passionate about trying to extrapolate some interesting information about languages, language learning, you can start to see it from a different perspective. This is the famous, I mean, it's hard to make out the particular languages, but this is the famous tree that you've probably seen various visualizations for of Indo-European languages. But this way, it's represented in a circle. And the lines, you don't see them on this version, but the lines are coming out and it's splitting. And it's nice to see it in this giant circle like that. It's a different perspective. You start to see how many languages take up what chunk of the circle. So sometimes it's not just about getting the right information, but presenting it in a way that is striking somehow. Another example is, this is one I found someone else did, of letter frequency. I like what they did here. You know, you've got these really cool bars coming out showing you like how deeply out they go, represents how much one letter comes up in comparison to other letters. And this is a nice, you know, hit in the face of you see it instantly that one letter strikes you more than another in certain languages. And whether you use this information to some positive benefit is up to you. It's always about not the information you have, but what you can do with that information. And I wanted to see what's the new information we can get from something that's already publicly available. So here's another interesting one I found. The most controversial topics on Wikipedia per language. In this one, all they had to do was look at the number of reverts. Like people would keep trying to change an article and it would have to keep going back to a previous version. So like how many times were things getting edited and adding a bit of controversy because people disagreed so much on those edits. And this could tell you a lot about a language and it could tell you a lot about a culture. And you can see how it's split into yellow is religion. So, You could see in China, for instance, they don't really care that much. Barely any edits for that. But then we have thicker ones for Arabic and Hebrew. And all sorts of other ones that you start to see specific topics, like the, the fifth most edited topic in Portuguese. If you're a gremista, you know, you follow the Grêmio team from Porto Alegre, the south of Brazil, then you're going to want to make sure that either Wikipedia says that they're the worst team in the world or that they're the best team in the world, you know? Which really says a lot that one of the most edited articles on the Portuguese Wikipedia is about futebol, you know? Really does. So that's just something I've found very interesting. You get this new information just by looking at something actually quite boring, just the amount of times particular articles are edited, but you extrapolate that to all articles, and something starts to show you patterns eventually. So you can use this information to help you maybe understand topics of controversy, because you can ask people, but sometimes just asking people doesn't help you as much as looking at the data, because people are not very good judges of what is truly happening in the world sometimes. We all have our biases. I tend to see specific things that are controversial while I'm not aware of other things. So to truly have a bigger view, something like Wikipedia is based on millions and millions of people using it. And that gives you information that you can actually act on and you understand the kind of topics that you want to dive into and discuss a little bit. And so where do you get this information? There's a lot of different ways. I like what some institutions actually have open data. They make some parts of their data set available to everybody. So Duolingo, for instance, shows us how many people in the US per state are actually using Duolingo in the past year from whenever this chart was made. And you can kind of see these states pop out, but what is more interesting is if you can combine that with something else and start to see a story emerge. So another data set that Duolingo have is the most popular languages. And look at that. We have mostly French pop up and English, of course, in the states that tend to have more immigrants. So this starts to paint you an interesting picture. Maybe from this you know, wow, in Hawaii there's quite a demand for Japanese learning materials. Maybe I can use that to go help Hawaiians learn Japanese. And this is something that a lot of businesses have been starting to realize. And data scientist is one of the most in-demand jobs in the world right now. You can leave university starting with a six-figure salary because of how useful it is. If you analyze this stuff, show it to people who are running the companies, and you have proof that in in Hawaii, Japanese is a popular language to learn. Rather than guesswork, rather than being in Hawaii, sitting in a bar and talking to another tourist, and the tourist tells you, yeah, like 2 people are learning Japanese that I just bumped into. That's interesting, but it's not real data. It's a very restricted sample. So this is the kind of thing that gives you real information that you can act on. And I've been getting into this a lot because I need to apply this to my business. Because I have a very big blog. I have a lot of people coming to it. I have a very big email list. Email list has 300,000 people on it. So the problem is that I found with time, less people are opening the emails. And I want to make sure that I'm getting the message to the people as they are signing up and trying to check things out. And the reason is, if I'm sending the same message to everybody, then I have to cater to a wider group of people, so the message starts to get less potent. Because maybe if I say something in one particular way with my snarky voice, then that'll offend so many people. And they'll write to me and say, how dare you write like this? And then I have to kind of water down the way I write to not offend everybody. But what if I could split the kind of messages I'm writing and give it to the people exactly how they would like it? So I know what language people are learning. So maybe I can send out emails just to those people, giving them Spanish learning materials. I know what people tend to click links to buy things and people don't. So I can make sure to not send so many paid links to, here's an expensive €100 thing, to all these people who are clearly not interested. And that means it can be a better experience for them. They're more likely to open the emails more and interact more, and I can give them information that's genuinely relevant to them. So this is why I've been investigating this. I want to, when my email list was small and very specific to the very small community that I had at the start, people liked it more because the community was a very specific type of person. And now that it's bigger, it's much wider. So how about if I try to go back to what made it successful and made it specific to each individual community as much as I possibly can? So that's kind of what got me passionate about the whole thing. But there's other things that I can see. And for most of these, I'm going to start using publicly available data to show you. Because obviously, anything I might get, again, even with my 300,000 people, that's still 300,000 people who are likely to use the internet, read blogs in English, like my language learning approach, not hate Irish people. You know, there's all these ways you're restricting the group. But publicly available information that a lot of governments are making available to everybody, so you can act on this, you can analyze it. You can analyze it for free in lots of very simple software that will make pretty maps like this for you. Could tell you some interesting things. So for instance, foreign language speakers in the US. Okay, this looks kind of similar to the Duolingo chart, but let's switch things up a little bit. Instead of saying all the speakers, what about the particular languages? If we pick Chinese, of course, this is, a lot of these censuses tend to group Cantonese, Mandarin together. That's an unfortunate part whenever I see Chinese come up in this. But you can see, specifically, New York and California stand out. They tend to have a lot of immigrants, okay. So maybe there's a story that can be told there. But some of these other languages start to draw different pictures. So for instance, French. And look at that. New York and California aren't jumping out so much now. Here we have, down there, Louisiana, and up here, Maine. So why is that? This could tell you something very interesting about the language story that's happening in those places. And as it happens, the further northeast you go, the closer you get to Quebec. So it kind of spills over. And I actually drove from the Quebec province into Maine, and the weirdest thing, the sign, even though I was in the United States after passing the border, and there's no official status for French, the sign said, "Bienvenue à Vermont." And I was like, okay. And I said it out loud, and my partner Lauren was like, "No, it's Vermont. Vermont. Don't ever say Vermont." And I was like, okay, if you say so. And I actually did hear a little French in the street. And of course, Louisiana had a huge influx of French speakers, but here it's actually including French Creole. And that changes things quite a lot, because I went to Louisiana, and I wanted to make a little documentary about French spoken in Louisiana, and I figured there'd be like a giant town of pure French speakers or something. And it's not quite what I came across. What I came across was more that there were no modern French speakers, but there were families in rural areas who tended to have either French spoken themselves or whose children were proud of their heritage and put French as the languages they spoke. The same way when I finished secondary school, I put on my CV, German, very good, even though I got a C and I couldn't say the most basic phrases. You know, I just figured a C, well, that's good, I passed. So I must have very good German. without even like trying it with a person. So there is that this is again census data. So the data is a little skewed. But I still think that the other side of it is interesting too, because I did hear some French when I was in New Orleans, and I saw a lot of French culture there. You know, the beignets that you can eat in this lovely cafe downtown. It feels like France, and there's that kind of lingering, maybe not linguistic side of things in terms of people speaking it, but there's that cultural side a little bit. And that does matter. That's part of the story. But things got a little interesting when I switched it up again and went for German. What on earth is North Dakota doing there? I looked into this. I was like super confused when that happened. And I found that not only is it very dark as it is here, apparently 1.4% of the population speak German. Turns out it's the most spoken second language. It's the only state in the US that has a second language mostly spoken that isn't Spanish. Because Spanish jumps out all the time, clearly, because there's a lot of integration with Mexico and the rest of Latin America, long history with the Spaniards, so obviously there's going to be a lot of Spanish in the US. But German, so I needed to know why. North Dakota, why? And it turned out that there was this historically Germans who lived in Russia. And it's because they felt a little bit of persecution, like maybe 2 or 3 centuries ago. And at the time, Russia gave them more freedom to express their religion and so on. But then things changed in Russia in the 19th century, and they got way more restrictions. So a very large group of farming Germans living in Russia moved to places in the US where they could farm. North Dakota came and said, we've got plenty of land for you. So it's interesting. I never would have known that if it weren't for the data, you know? And all sorts of other things, like things that just stand out that are just interesting anyway. Hindi, New Jersey came up very high. And I looked into that. I looked into the publicly available information on New Jersey's state website. And I found there was just one little part of the district. It was just 1 square kilometer that just happened to have a really big community of Indians. And so it skewed the data, you know? So it's good to know that, because otherwise you would think, looking at this, oh, when I go to New Jersey, I got to brush up on my Hindi, you know? So that's pretty interesting. But let's go down, narrow the field a little bit. As you guys probably know, I live in New York. New York's a pretty multilingual city. Anytime I get the subway and walking around, I always hear someone speaking another language. A little thing I like to do when I hear them talking is I'll like turn to Lauren and I'll start translating what they're saying. And I'll be like, okay, so he's saying he's cheated on his girlfriend with the girl that he found in that party. And she's like, I don't want to know, I don't want to know. And it's fun. It's fun to live in a nice, big, multilingual city, but it doesn't look like it, does it? You look at this, and English is clearly the language. I mean, obviously it's going to be English, but you see little bursts of, the Spanish communities in the Bronx, and you got a little bit of Russian down here. That's nice, but what if we could just take away English? Let's do that. If we change the graph and exclude English, then it starts to get a little bit more colorful. Okay, so now we have much larger showings of the Russian community here. We've even got some French Creole jump up, but still we got the Spanish. Of course, there's going to be a lot of Spanish speakers. So let's exclude Spanish, see what we can see from that then. Exclude English and Spanish, and it turns into this gorgeous, multicolored universe of languages here. All the way, even in Manhattan, you have the Mandarin, Cantonese, and other Chinese languages popping up all over the place. And you got more Hebrew and everything under the sun. And this is helpful because you could see where the Italian communities are. Maybe you would want to be able to improve your Italian. You can't travel to Italy, but you can find parts of your hometown. And you could do this yourself. You can do this with your own hometown in many cases. Like both the US and the European Union have these very big pushes for open data, for giving access to this information that anyone can use. Okay, that's New York, but what about London? London, of course, whoops, yeah, there it is. London, what I like is it doesn't have a particular second language that jumps out. These are particular parts. It's kind of hard to make out here because the map isn't showing the river and so on. But you could see which languages are jumping out, and that could paint you a particular picture. But something a little bit more useful. How about you coordinate those to the particular tube stations? And then you can know which part of London you'll get out and which language you're more likely to hear. There we go. That's a lot nicer. Now I know where I can speak some French, some Arabic, and so on. And this, again, is something any one of you can do. Okay. So, with that in mind, with these nice visualizations, you can start to make decisions on, and start to understand the context of your language and how and where it's spoken. And here's another one that if you're learning Greek, then you can find out where, other than Greece, where are the Greek speakers? And you have the obvious ones pop up, but then you see that 1.6% of Australia are native Greek speakers, according to the census. I mean, obviously, some of this isn't going to be 100% accurate because these are people self-reporting. They're not passing Cepheler tests or anything. But it gives you a bit of an understanding. At least you'll know where the communities are, and they could connect you with their grandparents who'll speak the language. So this, you can see, the reason I was setting things up ahead of time is because instead of using PowerPoint, I wanted to be able to just randomly see what comes up here. So Czech, for instance. I don't know, I haven't seen this. Austria, it's right next door, but you have 16,000 people there. So this is something I've used in my travels, not so much until this year, using the actual data science, but maybe you would notice a lot more the places you go, you tend to find languages you don't expect. I found, interestingly, when I was traveling through Brazil, a lot of Hebrew speakers. Because Israelis tend to have their time after the army to kind of travel the world. A lot of them went to Brazil. And I was amazed. They're it's the biggest group of tourists that tend to go to the country. So that's just fascinating. But I learned that by the hard way of getting a ticket and moving my life there for an entire year that I've spent in total in Brazil to find that nice little quirk of information. Whereas just with a bit of clicking, you can find out these kind of things yourself and see if you are going to a country, what kind of languages are you likely to run into? Okay, so for the rest of the talk, I want to try and delve into a very specific question. It's always on language learners' minds. What is the best language to learn? The best language. Whenever someone asks me this, I always kind of think to myself, I could create an army of Navi speakers, and be ready for the next Avatar movie. But no, instead, I try to tell them that essentially, I don't like how a lot of the information tends to be presented because it only looks at one thing. Just looks at the number of speakers or the one with the best economic potential. And I think that this is a complex question. And if you're not going to look at your own situation, which I tend to like more, if I can, to tell people to just see what one are you passionate about? What language have you got a family connection to and that you really want to talk to the people? Did you have some kind of really personal reason to learn? But that aside, you can indeed use some data as long as you are inventive and you see what can you pull beyond just the number of speakers. Because in this case, you could see that just the number of speakers, even once you get past the first 10, you start to get some interesting information that people don't really take into account. Telugu, I don't know if I'm saying that right, that's the number 11 language. How many people here speak it? I don't see any hands. For the 11th most spoken language in the world, a room full of polyglots. You call yourselves polyglots. I don't speak it either. I don't even know if I pronounced it right. So this is interesting. But of course, the number of people who speak the language is not the entire picture. There's a reason that we don't tend to learn these languages in the 10 to 20 list. I mean, way more of us learn Italian, which is all the way down at number 20, than learn a bunch of these other languages. And so just saying number of speakers, because people are always talking about Mandarin, but there's a bigger context to take into account here. So that's what I want to look at. So first, let's take that information, the bar chart, and present it in a much nicer way. So this is a different visualization. Put it all in a circle, and this represents the population of the Earth, and then taking that based on number of native speakers. It's not perfect, because they did dialects for Arabic, but they didn't do it for Chinese. Like, why? I don't know. But in general, it's good. It gives, you can see the Telugu here is a pretty big chunk of the chart. You can see how many based on the dialects as well. You can even see, like, you can just about make out there, I point to it. There's Ireland. Yay. So that's interesting. And I think this is a lot better than bar charts because this is combining it with the total population of the planet. And you can see how big of a chunk is coming out here. And maybe this will influence your decision. But let's dive deeper. Let's see what else we can see. What about the financial or the social value? So this is a interesting graph someone came up with that I found a nice way of, oh, I got a new follower on Twitter. This is an interesting way of presenting it. Essentially, the left side, or the vertical axis, is something they came up with called the gross language product. And they essentially based it on like the potential financial usefulness, and they combined it with a little bit of the gross domestic product. So it's their own little algorithm. It's a rule of thumb. But then on the other axis, just more speakers. And as you also have like larger circles. But of course, English jumps out. It's got that higher influence in terms of financial decisions that people make. It's got, you know, good coverage there. Rich countries tend to use it. Whereas Mandarin, on the other hand, it has more speakers, but then the GDP for those speakers averages 5,680 compared to 46,391. So that's an interesting piece of information to take into account. You would want to have like the best combination of the two. And then you start to see countries that have smaller number of speakers, like Japanese, have a much higher GDP. So maybe in terms of which language will benefit my career more, you might want to lean in that direction. But you still want to like push things over, and then you still have the likes of Spanish that has like a much larger group of countries, a lot of variation there. So this is useful information, but we can dive a bit deeper. What about our general worldwide reach? So essentially, this is talking about the number of countries, because Mandarin has only really official status in, I forget if it's 2 countries or if it's just China, but it's like a very small number compared to Spanish and English that have a wider number of countries. So that changes these graphs a little bit. And you pick the 4 countries start to emerge: Spanish, English, Arabic, and French. Of course, we're talking modern standard Arabic here rather than the dialects, so you still need to dive into the data a bit more, but we can use that. Okay, let's start to combine a few things. Let's combine good volume and good reach. So here, there are two things happening. We have the bars, that are the countries where the language is the primary language, for more than 0.1% of the population. And then we have the circles, that are just the number of speakers worldwide. And you'd start to see how things are not overlapping as much. So Russian comes out here as according to combining this data, it pops out as the 5th language in this list, you know? And you have these different points coming out, and it's starting to draw a little bit of a picture for you. But there's still more that we can investigate. So, asking the question of just basic wealth, the language you all should be learning is Monegasque, the language of Monaco. Yeah. So, how many Monegasque speakers here? Oh, we got one. Richest polyglot in the world. Excellent. They speak French, of course. You go to Monaco, you're going to speak French. So just basing it on particular specific questions are not going to paint the picture. This is why this question that keeps coming up, which language should I learn? You pick it based only on GDP, then you're going to get this answer. And this answer is not quite that useful, you know? But let's combine that with other things. The next thing that comes up a lot is the difficulty factor. So you've all seen the Foreign Language Institute coming up with this list of the amount of hours. I'm not a big fan of this. I think it depends on a lot of factors. I personally found Spanish took me a lot more hours because it was the first language I learned. I had less confidence. But in general, on a wider scale with a group of people, it leans in this direction for English speakers, okay? But let's change that list into this nice visualization here. So we have the number of hours and corresponding that with the particular languages. So here we got this 750 to 900, and there you got your list of languages that cover that. So you might want to start with the nice bright blue languages. Going over here. And this again is close to English. And this visualization just shows you that story that the Foreign Language Institute has come up with, and shows it to you in a nice, pretty way. And that's just something I like when it comes to data science, is how the information is represented. So for English speakers, you get a clear choice. We come right back to this graph again, but you combine it with the speakers gained per hour of study versus the gross language product, which is essentially an altered version of the GDP combined with the language. And now, Spanish starts to jump out. And this is kind of in coordination. This is why the wisdom of the crowd starts to come out. I've always wondered, why in Ireland do we tend to only have German and French available to us as the main languages we pick in school? It's because these languages are high on this chart. They tend to give the most benefit. And I think this chart gives us the best for English speakers, because the right is kind of the amount you get out of the hours you put in. And again, you're going by the Foreign Language Institute. It's a rule of thumb. It's not exactly right for everybody, but essentially maybe Spanish and Italian have the same number of hours, but the potential you get out of one versus the other is very different. So the data paints that picture for you. And that's for English speakers. We don't have a study necessarily for each language like the Foreign Language Institute has, but you can combine that with something like this. The lexical distance among languages of Europe. Of course, you could zoom out and you could show it between languages of other places. But maybe this will show you a picture of your difficulty level, like how difficult it is going from one language to another. Is you could connect the dots and give this distance some kind of a unit, add it to a chart, and there you go. You can draw a new picture. You can see if you're a native speaker of one of these languages, what your new story is going to be. Maybe what language you should be learning next. Thank you for that. Okay, so ultimately, what have we learned from all this? I would say if you speak English, learn Spanish. If you don't speak English, learn English, because that comes out in terms of financial advantage. And if you just want to talk to the richest people, learn Monegasque. So yes, thank you very much.
Hi, I just had a question about your GLP and what variables that weighted towards more heavily, how that was calculated.
What they did for that, and I have I can share this with people on the Facebook group or something, so you can see where all this data came from. But essentially, you're taking the gross domestic product, and you are doing that as a relation to the population. So it's like a per capita thing, and then associating it with that group of speakers. So you would essentially just group Spain and Argentina and all the other Spanish-speaking countries and get their average GDP, and then get the total amount of people, and they would essentially come up with the number that way. It's an okay way to have a general idea of the financial value of a language based on just dividing by the number of people who speak it. Yeah.
Sorry, a bit of a technical question. How did you create the interactive maps for your iPad?
Yep, very good question. So 2 ways of doing this. First way is learn Python. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, if you learn Python, there's what's it called, Matplotlib. There's like special libraries that let you represent this data, and essentially a lot of the open source information from governments has GPS coordinates, or you can do some kind of a mapping if it's just per state to force it to have GPS coordinates, and then link it to a map and just make the colors change based on that. It does require a lot of programming though, but if you're confident in Python, you can easily do this. Now, if you're not confident in Python, how I came up with just 1 or 2 that I did myself and the rest that I was able to use in the presentation is software called Tableau, Tableau, and that is paid and free, and the free version lets you do everything that you see here as long as your data is shared with the world. So it's a nice little kind of open source initiative that if you discover some really useful information, then the only way you can visualize it is if you visualize it on the Tableau community website, so everyone else can see it, and they can search for it and they can share it. And that's how I could share all this with you, is all of this was stuff other people, a lot of it was stuff other people came up with that I was able to incorporate, and I can put it back up online. And then the paid version lets you like privately show it to people. So yeah, Tableau doesn't require any programming knowledge at all. You just essentially grab the data. You do need to understand how CSV files work, for instance, but they're essentially just fancy Excel files. You'll get used to them in no time. And you pull that in, and it's very visual. You drag things, you click a picture of a map, and it's very, very intuitive. And the online version is free. So Tableau, yeah. All right?
Thank you very much, Benny.
Thank you.